Hello and welcome to the Leadership Zone. Today, what I wanted to talk about was one of the special reports that the Irish Times did this month. And they called it the Employee Value Proposition Report, but ultimately we're talking about employee attraction and retention. And there are some key points in that report that I think are quite helpful for the Irish public, for employees, and for leaders to consider in their work. So while I have written an article on it and the links are below, and there's a couple of posts on social media, I thought that it'd be helpful for the Leadership Zone to think about some of these pieces. So sometimes you'll hear me say employee value proposition today, and sometimes you'll hear EVP. But EVP encompasses all of the benefits and values that you as a leader and employer offers to employees in exchange for their skills and commitment. And we know that over the last 10, 15, 20, 25 years, there's been an increase in people being concerned with EVP and not just with salaries, which creates some interesting conversations about negotiations. Do I say the number? What does it include? But it also involves benefits, obviously, like salary and other bonuses, and also the intangible aspects such as work culture and career development opportunities. And this is where a lot of conversation about culture is coming to the forefront currently. People are thinking about culture from a business perspective, and there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, I'd love it if everybody was motivated to have, positive, morally based workplaces. But the reality is that every workplace is designed to produce some kind of outcome. If you're a social justice organization, then that's the outcome you're trying to produce. If you are a profit organization, then that's the outcome. If you are a not-for-profit in some way, then your outcome is usually on the people or the social justice outcomes that you're trying to achieve. If you're public sector, it's probably the civil servants, public servants, and your focus is on the citizen. And so regardless of what you're serving, the reality is that organizations that take culture into consideration serve their purpose better because they take care of their employees to the extent that's required for good performance. And like I said, I'd like to think that everyone's doing it from a heart place, but the reality is in organizations only exist to achieve the outcome that they've been built to achieve. And so we have to talk about and think about how our efforts with employees relate to that and how our efforts around leadership relate to that. And so when we think about that, the first starting point, and you'll be sick of hearing this from me, is thinking about the inclusive leader. And often the feedback that I'm getting around the book, Inclusive Leadership, Navigating Organizational Complexity, again, the link is below. But one of the interesting pieces of feedback is people's emotional reaction to the position that I take, which is that inclusive leadership is about using inclusion in your leadership responsibilities. It's about leading in your organization and producing the outcomes. So it's not separate to performance or to organizational performance or individual performance or team performance, but is actually a method of creating performance. And that can be really difficult for those who are invested in inclusion from a moral or a social standpoint. And it's not that I don't believe that those are valid standpoints. It's that what we're seeing in organizations and in industry is that those standpoints are often left behind during times of challenge and crisis. And if we want inclusion, even if it's from a moral perspective or from a social justice perspective in our organizations, they have to be integrated and relate to organizational performance on some level. Otherwise, when things get tough, you'll find that the efforts of inclusion are left behind. And so it's not that I don't value inclusion from a moral or social standpoint, but then in organizations, your leadership will not be successful if it doesn't help the organization succeed. And one of the examples I have was I was speaking to somebody in the UK and we were talking about inclusive leadership. And he said, look, I didn't get to my position because I'm inclusive. I got because I'm an effective leader. And I agreed with him. And he said, inclusion wasn't important 10 years ago. While people were talking about it, it wasn't being utilized for organizational success. And so the people in my experience, and this is in his words, were motivated to go because they had a direct benefit either to their own identity or to those that they cared about. And he said, but one of the reasons I'm thinking about inclusive leadership now isn't because I have a direct impact, like a benefit from engaging, but it's because when I look around my organization and I see the challenges we're facing with employee attraction and retention, with performance, with loyalty, that one of the ways to combat this is to actually develop an inclusive culture. And so he said, Sheila, I'm not here to talk to you about inclusive leadership from a moral point of view or social justice point of view. I'm here to talk about it from a business point of view. And lots of people cringe when I tell that story or talk about that. And I'm just giving that example of that story because I hear that conversation all the time when I talk to senior leaders. And when I talk to people who aren't in senior leadership positions, they're very strong about what senior leaders should do. And they're very strong about why they should do it, the moral imperative. And what they're often missing is actually the role of a senior leader is to keep those doors open and to keep the organization going forward. And when I spoke to that leader in particular, another time, he said, it's this simple. If I don't keep those doors open, there's no one to include. We're looking at layoffs. So we have to find the balance between keeping the doors open, doing good business, and inclusion. And that led us to a really good conversation because ultimately he was seeing inclusion as in competition with the door staying open. And when I unpacked that with him a bit further, the reason he was seeing it differently wasn't because it is different, because I would argue it's not. My book argues it's not. And a lot of the work I do with senior leaders would demonstrate that it's not. But because of the narrative that was currently being used in inclusion efforts, which were morally and social justice orientated. And so leaders were seeing inclusion and inclusive leadership as something opposed to organizational performance or business effectiveness. And so one of the things that I want to talk about in terms of employee experience or value proposition, in your words, it might just be the experience people are having and therefore how long they want to stay and grow within the organization. Inclusive leadership is not about distracting from the leadership agenda by any means. It's completely and utterly about making it stronger, more robust, and improving the excellence. And why I say excellence is a lot of universities have excellence in their manifestos and their visions. And when I bring inclusive leadership to universities, which I do across Europe, the UK, and in Ireland, there is this kind of idea or belief that diversity results in lowering standards. And I argue and can evidence from lots of different pieces of research that diversity brings a robust way of thinking. And often people from experiences that are not traditionally supported or have more barriers or biases facing them will often work harder and be more robust in their approach than others because they've had to be in order to get there. And so I just want to be very clear that inclusive leadership, when we're talking about employee engagement, retention, and we're talking about the report from the Irish Times, is utterly about organizational performance, business effectiveness. And when I link between inclusive leadership and the points that the report make, I'm using inclusive leadership very specifically because we know that inclusion within the boundaries of organizational realities can help with so many of the challenges people and organizations are facing today with the employee experience, their retention, attraction, career development, all of the things, succession planning, all of these things can be supported by inclusive practices utilized at any level of the organization by any type of leader. And what are the leaders? If you read the book, you'll see I position leadership in three ways. There's a positional leader, which is the leader that gets the title. There is the social leader. That is the person who people go to and trust because of the relationships and networks that person's built, and because there's a sense of investment and integrity in that relationship. And then there's the thought leaders, and they're the people who develop the thought or have expertise or provoke people to think more about different elements of the business. And so there are three types of leaders that can exist at any level of the organization. And it's really important that you're leading from where you are. And so as you're listening to this, if you keep thinking, I'm listening to this leadership podcast because I want to be a leader, or you're thinking, I'm listening because I am a leader and I need some additional thoughts about it, what I want you to think about is leadership is a social exchange that is happening in any given moment. And yes, your title might help with it. Your social network and your relationships might help with it. Your thought leadership or your expertise might help with it. But your role in any moment is to figure out what's needed to help the conversation or the team or the solution move forward. And when we're talking about employee experiences and we're talking about value propositions, then it's really important you're thinking about yourself and a leader as this, that you're not just thinking about formal power and blaming up or blaming out, because we know that the more senior leaders are, the more they blame out, whereas the more junior leaders are, the more they blame up. But it's really important that we're thinking about what you can do. So the first thing to think about is employee value proposition can help you think about competitive compensation. So why it matters, when we benchmark pay against the market, it ensures that you remain competitive within the market, which will help you not just attract, but retain top talent. But also, when you ensure that pay is fair and transparent, employees won't be distracted by those types of additional conversations. They won't be concerned with other peers being paid the same or differently to them. And they won't be concerned with kind of unpacking those things. Instead, their focus will actually be on how they can benefit the organization. And so it's important that when we think about transparency, that you're not just saying, well, we do the gender pay gap, or kind of trying to do these generic comments, but that you actually realize when you don't have clear benchmarking externally for employees to see, and you don't have a fair and transparent process, employees are going to utilize their thinking, their expertise, their emotional energy on worrying about those things. And so part of it is sharing it for transparency, but part of it is also to stop that being a distrust that exists in your organization. So from an inclusive leadership point of view, what you can do is try to advocate for more fair and equitable compensation practices. You can encourage benchmarking. You can encourage transparency where it's appropriate to be transparent. And I'm not talking about saying this person gets paid that. I'm talking about giving ranges of payment, especially if it's in a private sector where there isn't that easy access that there is in the public sector. So that's something to think about. The next thing you need to think about is building an inclusive and fair culture. And think about inclusion from the measure that Shaw et al. 2011 uses, which is that inclusion is facilitating the experience of belonging and uniqueness. And belonging is, I know that I'm valuable here. And uniqueness is, I don't have to be like everyone else in the way I deliver my value. And that's kind of the very basic scientific definition. If you think about that and you think about creating a fair culture, one in which people both belong and can bring their uniqueness, what you're going to do is set up a culture for thriving and performing. And so if you utilize an inclusive leadership principle from the book, then what you can do is you can lead by example. You can ensure that policies and procedures are considering fair treatment and equitable opportunities. You can also address any unconscious bias, or how you can foster more valuing of uniqueness. And that doesn't just have to be the traditional ideas of diversity, which fall often under discrimination legislation, but actually thinking about what kind of environment can we create where people thrive and can be themselves, and we create a richness and a robustness. And even just that question, how can I create more fairness? How can I address more unconscious bias? And if you read the book, you see that I don't recommend unconscious bias training to address it. But I think that what we can do is think about how you intervene with how unconscious bias creates inequity in your organization. And you can do that much better than just sending people on training. You can actually inbuild it into your processes. So thinking about how you can do that. Then when you offer professional development opportunities internally, it does a couple of things. It helps staff and employees and people feel valued, but it also helps people see that you don't just value them for their current role, but for the potential, which then has often high performers motivated to do more, not just internally, but in terms of their own development. This again increases the likelihood of hanging on to top performers and invested employees, but it also promotes a kind of culture of which people know that it's a good place to work and that people who are staying are top performers, because we know that there can be a culture in some organizations where the people staying are just repeating what they've done for the last 10 or 20 years, and there isn't much growth or development. And when you have organizations that do that, you're not going to attract the best talent, because people can see that the people who've stayed have either stayed doing the same thing the same way, or they've stayed because they've got comfortable. Whereas if you're promoting professional development opportunities, you're going to have a very different experience of who stays and who that attracts. Also, if you improve your effective employee engagement and communications, and I say effective as a starting point because a lot of employee engagement and communication isn't effective. It's not actually landing what you think it's landing. It's not having the impact that you think it's having. So it's important that if you are utilizing communications and different methods of employee engagement, you might have reward statements, you might have, transparent performance management processes. There's a number of things you can do. But if you can think about, is it effective? And I say this when I teach on the diploma all the time. People say, is this the right thing to do? Is that the wrong thing to do? Actually, wrong is real. I often say wrong is real, right isn't. What I mean by that, there's lots of things you can do wrong legally. ethically, morally in an organization. But in terms of what's right, that is not decided based on what other people are doing and what's worked. It's actually based on you looking at what is needed in your organization and then thinking about how you can get the data or insight to ensure that your intervention is effective. I think, in my experience over the last kind of 3 years, especially, I think organizations put a lot of effort into how they say things and, what they're communicating, but not often into having the data to decide what to communicate. And what I mean by that is that often there's kind of second guessing, perfecting the email rather than doing the relational work with employees and people to understand what are their kind of green flags and red flags in communication and what are their needs. So if you understand their needs from the communication, you can be more effective. But if you are just trying to perfect communication, which is what a lot of organizations are doing, you're trying to do something to your people with communication rather than creating a communication process that's reciprocal in some way. So make sure, I often say, make sure that the data effort up front, the reciprocal dynamic with communication and employee engagement is live, rather than spending all the extra time and effort into perfecting emails or communications that may not have the impact you think they're having. And then the other piece is about innovation and adaptation. It's really important that managers and supervisors and team leads and senior leaders in organizations are constantly developing and adapting and innovating, or supporting adapting and innovating. Because one of the things that happens is that people get comfortable and we start solving problems the same way. And we kind of say things like, oh, it's more efficient, but we're not staying with the process or the nuances. I had the mick taken out of me this week. At the end of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion and Belonging diploma with UCD, I do this piece where people have to say what they learned. So not what we taught in the sessions, but what they learned, what they're taking away. And one group had a whole meme about nuances everywhere. And I think it was from Buzz Lightyear, from the Toy Story was the meme they used. But one of the things that was funny was they were taking the mix saying, Sheila, you just keep saying nuances. This is my point, right? We want answers. We want the equal sign before we've understood the equation. And leaders, managers, team leads, supervisors, we need to be better at understanding what is in the equation before we jump to the solution. And the issue is that we're spending a lot of time applying technical solutions to complex issues in organizations. And employee engagement, value proposition, experience, culture development, these are complex issues because there isn't one solution for all, but you may need one process that allows the appropriate outcome for multiple people with multiple different needs. And so if we can think about nuances not as something slowing us down or something we should simplify, but as almost the secret sauce that tells us and gives us the detail we need for the actual solution, we're going to find that we do that much better. And that's where innovation and adaptation comes in really well. If leaders, managers, supervisors, team leads, trainee managers and leaders actually take time to think about and work with innovating solutions rather than just rushing to easy options, we're going to find that people feel more engaged, first of all, but also your outcomes are more effective. And we know from the research that change efforts often fail, from very small change efforts to very large change efforts. And the reason for this is that they're often being done to people and not with people. And so if nothing else, innovation and adaptation requires you, instead of jumping to the formula that you always use for solutions, is checking if that formula has the same elements in it that results in the outcome. And in my experience, you need to think about your work through a formula, which is, are these issues complex? If they are, what are the needs that people have? What are the risks involved with those needs? How might we achieve what's required without just repeating what others do? We need to have these conversations. We need to get this data. And there's lots of different ways to do it. But one of the most innovative and agile things you can do is make sure that you're getting data up front and then working with what you have, not aiming for perfect, but aiming for informed. And then as you get more details or data, you improve the communications or the approach that you're taking to innovating and adapting. So just keep that in mind. Also, just remember that if you don't align the employee experience, engagement, culture, value proposition to the business strategy, it will not be sustainable. It will become a HR duty or somebody's job, and it won't become part of how we all do business. And for employee value propositions to work, it has to be embedded into everything that we do. And this is why I don't give one-stop solutions. There are so many different ways you can do that, depending on what is needed, which is where the effective word comes back in. You can do lots of things that are not effective because they're not meeting the real needs of the organization. So it's really important that you think about the needs of the organization and what would be an effective way to go about that. And use the input from employees rather than constantly thinking that it must be done to them. Because we know when we engage employees in any efforts that it actually lends to their positive experience of the organization, as long as you follow through. So let's be clear, if you engage them, but you secretly made a decision or you're not going to follow through, then engaging them can be harmful. But let's say you're going to engage them, follow through, and you haven't already made the decision, then we know that the process itself can build trust regardless of the outcome. So I would say that to improve engagement, we need to use inclusive practices from the very beginning, not because we're trying to necessarily something to do with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging that your organization has decided you're doing, but actually because inclusive leadership helps us meet these everyday challenges that we're facing and helps us solve them in a way that our approach shifts how we're doing it, which then shifts the effectiveness and then shifts how people feel about the changes that we're making. So the report is really long. If you're subscribed to the Irish Times, I recommend you have a read of it. It came out, I believe, on the 14th of June. I've had to have a read through it, look at its different suggestions, think about how it links to inclusive leadership and effectiveness. And I think if we do a very brief recap is you need to understand employee value proposition in your organization, and you need all your employee people managers to do the same. You need to ensure that there's competitive compensation in the market and that there's a transparency to that. You need to build an inclusive and fair culture so that people will stay when they come. You need to develop professional development opportunities to manage lots of risk, but also to help create a culture that utilizes the maturity of employees staying, but without allowing organizational culture to become stagnant. You need to think about engagement and communication probably differently, and to think about it as something you do with people and not to people. And to create space for innovation and adaptation, anybody with people responsibilities needs to start thinking about the actual needs of any change or effort or intervention that they're doing, and thinking about the needs that it's meant to meet and who they need to understand their point of view in order to make sure that it's effective, rather than running with an approach or perfecting something privately. And last but not least, you need to link it to the business strategy. As you do with inclusion and diversity, anything to do with employee value proposition, engagement, retention, attraction needs to be linked to business strategy and interweaved at every level in every decision that it's relevant to. I hope that was helpful. You can follow the podcast either on YouTube or on whatever podcast platform you listen to. Please also rate the podcast because it's really helpful. And also pop over to any of the socials. My social is Sheila Walsh1 on any of the socials. The link is below. And you can buy the book, Inclusive Leadership, Navigating Organizational Complexity. It's currently available globally and in a number of fabulous international bookstores. And if you have any further questions, you can tag me on social media and let's have the conversation over there. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.